Am I wrong for exposing my boyfriend after I found out he cheated? My name's Sarah. I'm 26, with a quiet job, a small apartment, and an unshakable belief in love. At least, that was the case 2 years ago when I met Jake, the guy who would turn my life upside down in every way. From the moment we met, I thought he was everything I'd ever dreamed of. He was that rare mix of charm and depth, an artist's soul in a corporate job, kind to strangers, a soft spot for animals, and the sort of guy who would read poetry in the park. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, and by the end of the night, we were sitting on the fire escape of my apartment, talking until dawn about dreams, fears, and plans. It felt like we were cut from the same fabric. Our first months together were surreal. He'd send flowers to my office, write me little notes, and spend hours with me just talking. I started to believe that people could fall in love with their whole soul, that someone could see you in your entirety and still want to stay. And in those first months, I was the happiest I'd ever been. But then things started to change. Around a year into our relationship, I noticed tiny shifts. He'd get caught up at work more often, or he'd be too tired to come over after we'd made plans. His phone, once left out casually, became glued to him like a shadow. It was small things at first. He'd turn it face down when he set it on the table, or he'd get texts at odd hours and say, "Just work stuff," with a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hey everyone! I just met up with my ex after the cheating scandal, and he handed me a letter, claiming he owed me the truth. Now I'm about to dive into a new chapter, turning all that pain into something meaningful, but let's just say there's still a lot of unfinished business here. Would you give an ex a second chance to explain, or is it better to leave the past in the past? Let me know your thoughts below. And if you want to see how this journey unfolds, hit ***, subscribe **** for updates. One evening, I saw a name flash on his phone. Emily. It was quick, a notification that faded almost immediately, but it was enough. My heart raced, and when I asked him, he shrugged it off, saying she was a friend from work. His voice was smooth, too smooth, and his reassurance felt like empty words meant to pacify rather than explain. I wanted to believe him. But the weeks passed, and the feeling in my gut grew like a storm on the horizon. Every time he left his phone unattended, every time he was late, every excuse, it was as if a piece of the man I thought I knew was falling away, replaced by a stranger with a smile that no longer felt genuine. And then, one Friday night, everything shattered. We were curled up on the couch, watching our favorite series. His phone buzzed, lighting up with a text from Emily that read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." The words were innocuous but searing, as if someone had poured ice water over my head. I felt frozen, staring at those words that confirmed everything I'd feared. When I looked at him, his face was perfectly calm, oblivious. My heart pounded, my mouth went dry, and I felt like I was splitting in two. But I didn't say anything. I held back the storm raging inside and decided to wait until I had more than just a suspicion. That night, once he was asleep, I tiptoed into his office. My hands shook as I opened his laptop, remembering that he'd synced his messages ages ago. I pulled up his texts, and there it was. A relationship unfolding in words, pictures, and heart emojis, all exchanged with Emily. He'd taken her on dates, told her he felt so real with her, and worst of all, she had no idea I existed. He'd built a life with her, a life that should have been mine. The betrayal was like being punched in the chest. I felt sick, dizzy, every moment we'd shared flashing through my mind like a film unraveling. But the hurt was overtaken by something stronger, a furious determination. I wouldn't just confront him quietly. He didn't deserve that. I wanted him to feel the weight of his actions, to see the consequences of his lies. His birthday was coming up, and I knew it was the perfect time. In the days leading up to his party, I kept my composure, pretending nothing was wrong. Each time he kissed me, told me he loved me, or laughed with me, I felt the weight of the deception I was holding in, the knowledge that I was about to shatter the illusion we'd built. When the day of his party arrived, his friends and family filled our apartment, laughing, celebrating, completely unaware of what was coming. Jake was radiant, charming as always, the center of attention. He hugged me, whispered, "I love you," and I felt a pang of sadness for what we'd had, and the cold satisfaction of knowing he was about to face his worst nightmare. After everyone had settled with drinks in hand, I stood up, claiming I wanted to make a special toast. Jake looked at me expectantly, beaming. With a steady voice, I began, "This year has been full of surprises, right, Jake?" He laughed, nodding, clearly expecting a sweet, heartfelt tribute. But then, I pulled out my phone, which I'd connected to the TV earlier, and projected the messages between him and Emily. I read each message out loud, watching as his face morphed from confusion to horror. The room fell silent, the air thick with shock and disbelief. Friends shifted uncomfortably, some with their hands over their mouths, others exchanging glances of anger or pity. I locked eyes with him, feeling a wave of release as I said, "And that's why I'm done with you, Jake. Happy birthday." I raised my glass, took a long sip, and felt the weight of every lie lift from my shoulders. In the days that followed, I stayed with my friend Jenna, whose calm support was the lifeline I needed. My phone exploded with texts and calls from Jake, swinging between apologies and accusations. He said I'd gone too far, that I'd humiliated him, but I didn't care. The friends who reached out to me were shocked but supportive, telling me I'd done the right thing. Even Emily reached out to me. I'd expected sympathy or anger, but what I got was a bizarre confrontation. She called me to say she loved him and that I was the problem. She claimed that I was standing in their way and even suggested I step aside. Her words stung, but they also freed me. I realized then how much better off I was without either of them in my life. A few weeks later, Jake reached out one last time. He said he was sorry, that he'd broken things off with Emily and wanted to start over with me. But by then, the thought of being with him felt like a distant memory. I blocked him without a second thought. Through all the pain, I came to see my own strength. I started going to therapy, rediscovered old passions, and threw myself into work. And little by little, I began to heal. I realized that love is not about clinging to someone who betrays you, but letting go and choosing yourself. Jake's betrayal taught me that I deserved better than the crumbs he was willing to offer. Looking back, I'm grateful for the courage it took to stand up for myself. This was more than a breakup. It was a rebirth. And as for Jake, well, I hope he finally understands that actions have consequences. In the months after exposing Jake, I began to rebuild my life from the ground up. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I was still living in the shadow of our relationship, haunted by questions that couldn't be answered. Why hadn't he valued what we had? How had I missed the signs for so long? Some nights, those questions would keep me awake, running circles in my mind. But slowly, I learned to accept that I might never get closure from him and that it was okay. Some chapters in life end without the neat little bows we crave. Therapy helped, as did surrounding myself with friends who'd stood by me through the ordeal. Jenna became my anchor, inviting me over for cozy nights in, filling our time with movies, baking, and laughter. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace at her place, sipping hot cocoa and watching the flames flicker, she turned to me and said, "You know, you deserve to be loved fiercely, without all the lies." That night, something inside me shifted. I knew I had to let go, not just of Jake, but of the guilt, the doubt, the way I'd started to second-guess myself and my worth. Around this time, I threw myself into a new passion, photography. I'd always loved taking pictures, capturing moments, and seeing beauty in the ordinary, but now it became my therapy. My weekends were spent exploring my city with my camera, capturing vibrant street scenes, quiet moments in parks, laughter between friends. It was like I was learning to see the world, and myself, in a new light. Through my photography adventures, I met people from all walks of life, including artists, storytellers, and travelers. There was a freedom in sharing moments with strangers who knew nothing of my past. One person I met during these outings was Aaron. He was also a photographer, with a gentle warmth that felt like a balm to my bruised heart. Aaron had his own scars, stories of heartbreak and healing, of lost and found dreams, and somehow we connected over our shared journeys. Aaron and I would spend hours walking and talking, capturing sunsets and street scenes, laughing over spilled coffee and out-of-focus shots. He didn't pry into my past, and I didn't ask about his. It felt like we were meeting each other as we were now, two people who had seen love's darker side but hadn't given up on it. As the months passed, I noticed how different my life felt. Jake's memory became a distant echo, a lesson rather than an open wound. My nights were filled with editing photos, building a portfolio, and even considering submitting my work to local art galleries. For the first time, I wasn't living with half of myself attached to someone else's vision of me. I was whole, and it was beautiful. One night, Aaron and I sat on a rooftop overlooking the city lights, our cameras set aside. The silence between us was comfortable, like a gentle lullaby. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, and whispered, "You're stronger than you know, Sarah. Don't let anyone take that light from you." And in that moment, I knew I was ready to let love in again. Not with the blind trust I'd given Jake, but with a sense of knowing, a grounded faith in myself and in the journey that had led me here. Jake, in a way, had given me this gift by shattering the illusion of what I thought love was. Through the heartbreak, I'd found my strength, my independence, and a community of people who valued me for who I truly was. And when Aaron and I eventually grew close, it wasn't out of a need to fill the void, but out of a shared appreciation for life, love, and healing. Aaron and I grew closer, our connection unfolding slowly, naturally, like the photographs we both loved to take. But even as we spent more time together, there was a part of me that remained guarded, still holding back. It wasn't that I doubted him. It was more that I'd promised myself I'd never lose myself in someone else again. So, I held my ground, kept my independence, and made sure my life was full on its own, even as he became a part of it. One evening, Aaron invited me to join him at an exhibition where he'd be displaying some of his work. Walking into the gallery, I was struck by the raw, vulnerable beauty in his photographs. His shots captured fleeting moments of joy and melancholy, strangers' faces illuminated by city lights, and abandoned spaces where nature had begun to reclaim what humanity had left behind. It was like looking into a mirror of his soul. And as he stood beside me, looking both proud and nervous, I realized I'd never felt this kind of respect for someone before. I admired not just him, but also his craft, his dedication, his authenticity. As we walked home that night under the city lights, Aaron reached for my hand and asked, "So, what's next for you, Sarah?" There was a hint of playfulness in his tone, but I could tell he was genuinely curious, wanting to know where I saw myself heading. It was a question I hadn't really asked myself yet. I'd been so focused on the now, healing, rediscovering my passions, exploring my independence, that I hadn't looked too far into the future. But as I thought about it, I felt a stirring of excitement. "I'm not sure," I admitted, smiling up at him. "Maybe I'll keep pushing myself in photography. I've thought about creating a series around resilience, capturing stories of people who've come through the other side of heartbreak and found themselves stronger for it. I want to show people that healing is messy, but it's beautiful too." He squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with a warmth that made my heart race. "That sounds like exactly what the world needs, Sarah. I'd love to see you do it." We walked in silence for a while after that, the weight of his words settling into me. It was more than just encouragement. It felt like a nudge toward a future I hadn't dared to dream of yet. But as the days turned to weeks, that dream began to grow roots. One night, while editing some recent shots, an idea came to me. I could take this photography project on the road, travel to places where people had rebuilt their lives, and capture their stories. And maybe, just maybe, I'd ask Aaron to come with me. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. Sharing that kind of adventure with someone felt like a leap of faith I wasn't sure I was ready for. But part of me was ready to try, to see where this road might lead. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was short, a simple, "Hey," but my heart sank when I saw the sender's name, Jake. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of all those old emotions resurface. Why now? What could he possibly want after everything? Aaron's words from that rooftop came back to me. "Don't let anyone take that light from you." I knew I was stronger now, but there was a flicker of curiosity I couldn't ignore. What did Jake want? And was I ready to hear it? I set the phone down, turning off the light, but as I lay there in the dark, my thoughts kept racing, pulling me back to a part of my story I thought I'd left behind. I could feel that I was on the cusp of something big, something that would test everything I'd learned and all the strength I'd found. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in hand, staring at Jake's message. My finger hovered over the screen, debating whether to open it or delete it and pretend I'd never seen it. Part of me wanted to brush him off, to let his message disappear like the ghost of a life I'd already moved beyond. But something inside me, a mix of curiosity and closure maybe, pushed me to open it. The message was short, almost cryptic. "Sarah, I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk to you. There's so much you don't know. I owe you the truth." I closed my eyes, feeling a surge of resentment flare up. Asterisk the truth? What was left to say after everything? I'd exposed his lies in front of his friends and family, burned every bridge, and walked away without looking back. And yet here he was, reaching out after all this time, dangling the promise of the truth, like it could somehow justify his actions or take back the hurt. But what if he had answers to questions I hadn't dared to ask? Questions I thought I'd buried, but now felt bubbling back up. I felt an unsettling curiosity twist in my stomach, mixed with the bitter memories I'd worked so hard to let go. Taking a deep breath, I finally replied, "Fine, talk." He responded almost instantly. "Can we meet? Just one time. I'll explain everything. After that, you'll never hear from me again if that's what you want." The idea of seeing him again felt like reopening an old wound, but it also felt like a challenge, one I was finally strong enough to face. I agreed to meet him, choosing a quiet cafe far from the places we'd frequented together. I told myself this was just for closure, a chance to settle whatever was left lingering so I could move forward without looking back. On the day of our meeting, I walked in feeling the confidence of someone who had fought her way through heartbreak and come out stronger on the other side. Jake was already there, seated in the back corner, looking rougher around the edges than I remembered. His eyes lit up when he saw me, but I didn't allow myself to be swayed by the familiarity in his gaze. "Sarah," he started, voice soft, almost cautious. "I know I'm the last person you want to see. I know I hurt you." I stayed silent, letting him speak. Part of me wanted to demand an explanation, to lay out every wound he'd left on my heart. But instead, I waited, arms folded, keeping my expression guarded. He continued, "I know you won't believe me, but I never wanted to hurt you. When we met, I was in a dark place. My life was a mess, and you were everything I didn't think I deserved. I was terrified that if you really saw who I was, you'd walk away." I felt a flare of anger. "So you lied? You kept secrets and built some fake version of yourself to keep me around? How is that love, Jake?" He winced, looking down, but I wasn't here to make him feel better. "It wasn't love, Sarah," he admitted quietly. "It was fear. Fear of losing the best thing I'd ever had. But it's not an excuse, and that's not why I'm here." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is for you. It's a letter I wrote, a confession, I guess. I didn't expect you to read it, but I needed to say everything I couldn't say then. You don't have to open it now, just whenever you're ready." The envelope sat there like a weight, carrying the words I'd wanted to hear for so long, but wasn't sure I was ready for. I looked him in the eyes, feeling a strange sense of closure starting to settle in. "Jake, I've spent so long trying to understand why you did what you did, and honestly, I'm done trying. I don't need your explanations anymore." My voice softened. "But maybe reading this will help me let go, truly. I'll read it when I'm ready." He nodded, looking both relieved and pained, as though a part of him had been clinging to some hope of reconciliation. But this wasn't about him. It was about me finding peace, about reclaiming the pieces of myself he'd broken. I took the envelope and left the cafe, stepping out into the fresh air with the feeling of a weight lifting from my shoulders. I didn't open the letter right away. I slipped it into my purse and went about my day, carrying it like a reminder of the past I was ready to leave behind. That evening, as I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, I found myself staring at the envelope again. Curiosity tugged at me, and despite my reservations, I opened it. Jake's handwriting filled the page in careful, slanted lines, and as I read, I felt a strange mix of sadness and closure settle over me. He wrote about his mistakes, his insecurities, the reasons he'd sabotaged the only real love he'd ever known. He admitted that he'd been too cowardly to face himself, and that in his fear, he'd hurt the one person who truly saw him for who he was. It was both an apology and an explanation, one I didn't need but somehow helped to read. I finished the letter, folded it carefully, and set it aside. I felt the sadness, but not in a way that hurt. It felt like a goodbye to a chapter of my life that had shaped me but no longer defined me. That night, I called Aaron. I didn't tell him about Jake or the letter. I didn't need to. Instead, I told him about my idea to take the photography project on the road, to capture the stories of resilience I'd been dreaming of. His voice lit up on the other end. "Sarah, that's incredible. I'd love to help however I can." We made plans, talking late into the night about places we wanted to visit, people we wanted to meet, stories we wanted to tell. And as I hung up, I felt a quiet joy settle over me. My past would always be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. But even as I looked toward the future, I couldn't help but feel that Jake's letter was a reminder of something yet unresolved, as though my journey was only beginning. There were stories waiting to be told, secrets still to uncover, and in my heart, I knew this wasn't the last time my past would cross my path. The road ahead was open, full of possibility, and I was ready to face whatever lay ahead.